Welcome to Recalculating Small Business. Your hosts are Don Mazzella and Dan Perkins.
Dan, we are still digesting the new tax bill passed by Congress late last year. Every time I turn around, I hear a different opinion about it, whether it's good or bad for especially for small businesses, which are audiences. Well, we asked a real expert today to come on board and tell us more. He's Frank Brunetti. He's here. He practices in New Jersey. He's got a stellar career. And Frank, welcome to the program.
Well, thank you, Donald. I appreciate that. It's a pleasure.
Well, Frank, you got such a distinguished career. When I tried to sum it up, I couldn't. So I'm going to let you give us some of the highlights of what you've done before I ask the first question.
Okay, thumbnail sketch. I'm a practicing tax attorney for 45 years in New Jersey and New York. I'm a full-time professor at Fairleigh Dickinson University in New Jersey. I created the Masters of Science in Taxation program 30 years ago. I've taught for and written courses for the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants. I'm of counsel with a New Jersey law firm, and I've been associated with the United Nations on international tax for 15 years. And I've written many books, most recently Federal Tax Accounting, which is really a primer for accountants on a daily basis, and I've written other books and numerous articles. So I try to keep busy, Don.
You also have a new book out.
All right, Federal Tax Accounting, as I just mentioned, published by Wolters Kluwer, which is, as I said, going to be useful to many practicing accountants.
Well, before we go any further, how can people find that book and your other books?
Well, you can get it on Amazon. You can get it in print, or you can get it in ebook. Or you can go on the Wolters Kluwer website, and it's there as well. Okay.
And spell your last name for people, Frank.
Brunetti, Frank.
Well, I'm going to start off the question, then turn it over to Dan. But over this past weekend, I talked with 3 accountants, each of whom had a different view of the recent tax bill. But my question to you, on the whole, is it better or worse for small business at the end of the day?
That's an excellent question, and of course, like any good tax lawyer, I'll explain that it depends. First of all, you have to understand that the new act affects entities. As I taught my class teaching last night and going over this, you have corporations, which could be C corporations or S corporations, and of course you have partnerships and you have limited liability companies. So for the corporation, if your listener is a C corporation, they are going to have a tremendous drop in their tax rate from 35% to 21%, and so that's ostensibly a good thing. And when you do the math, I did a little bit of math on this. So if you take the C Corp regime, prior law and new law, and assume that you have $100 of taxable income, and you apply the rates as they were and they are now, the cash to the benefit of the owner is $10.67. In the case of flow-through entities, we're talking about S corporations, partnerships, and limited liability companies taxed as partnerships. The same $100 previously, under the prior law, assuming the owner was active in the business, because there are so-called active and passive rules. But if they were active, they previously had $60.40 in their pocket because they were taxed at 39.6. Under the new law, assuming they get the 20% deduction that I'm going to be talking about, they end up with a tax liability of $29.60, and they end up with $10 more in their pocket. So in both cases, first of all, in both cases, the new tax regime does benefit owners of C Corps and owners of flow-through entities, including those who own passive interests in flow-through entities, which happens, in which case they too have a $10 benefit under the Act. So if you do the math, it looks good, but that's where I think the easy part stops and the complicated part begins, because if you take the C corporation, which is subject to double taxation. Why is that? Because as a C corporation, you have a corporate level tax now at 21%, and then you have then you have to pay the earnings, or you have to take a salary. So the salary will get taxed at 37%, and then if you have dividend distributions, they'll be taxed at 20%. And so you're going to end up with a double tax regime, probably less than if you were a flow-through entity, because with flow-through entities you only get taxed once. So C corps, depending on the nature of the business and how long you plan on keeping the business and how you plan on exiting. We always think about exit strategy. How do you get out of whatever you're in the cheapest way possible? The answer is it may be good, it may be bad. So it's problematic from a mathematical point of view, but then flow-through entities become problematic from an operational point of view, because the law is somewhat difficult to go through, because as you probably know, if you have a LLC, if you have a S corporation or a partnership, the law says that you're entitled to a 20% deduction from gross income. Okay, not an itemized deduction, not an adjustment from adjusted gross income, but a deduction from gross income of 20% of domestic qualified business income. So what has happened in this Tax Act is they have created a whole host of definitions that you need to fit into to get the full benefit of the 20% deduction. Because if you do, as I showed you earlier with my mathematical analysis, you'll be $10 to the good as a result. What happens is the tax rate for an individual, as you know now, is peaks out at 37%. With the 20% deduction, assuming you can receive the full benefit, you're taxed at 29.6%. So corporations are taxed at 21%. So you might say, well, I think I'm better off with a corporation, but then again, as I mentioned earlier, you have to worry about double taxation, and how do you get the money out of the company? So it's Don. The answer, as you can see, as I go deeper and deeper down the rabbit hole, it gets more and more complex and really more specific to the particular business, not only the kind of business, but the entity that the business has been formed in, and also, as I can go into if you'd like, how the assets are owned and where the wages are paid. It's a bit of 3D chess, as if you want to liken it to something, because you have to move pieces around in the right place to potentially get your 20%.
Well, Dan, I'm just going to ask one follow-up question, because on the whole, do you as an expert think it's better or worse than what we had?
Well, from a business point of view, I think it is going to be better clearly for businesses. It's going to be better. It can't be any worse. Let's face it. If you were a pass-through entity, you were paying 39.6% plus other taxes. So clearly, it's going to be better, and hopefully, it'll be very good for all of your listeners, depending on how they set up their business. So I think it's going to be better, but it's going to require work on the part of the business owner and their tax advisor. Having a skilled tax advisor is going to be very important because these rules are arcane.
Hearing Frank, listening to all of this and knowing how complicated it is, it seems to me it's going to take about a year for all of us to straighten out our businesses. How should one go about looking at all of these factors that you brought up, and should they be talking to lawyers, accountants? Who should they be talking to, and what should they be looking for?
That's an excellent question. Now, I should point out that typically when new law is passed, the IRS issues guidance, typically in the form of what's called a notice, and then ultimately they adopt regulations. So far, of course, we have the law and just not much in the way of notices. And so going through some of these definitions, which I'd like to point out, can be difficult because we do not have guidance as yet. And so, in fact, I'm meeting with one of my clients tomorrow who was a C Corp, became an S Corp, and I'm meeting with the client, the accountant, the financial advisor to review whether they should remain the way they are, should they change, and so forth. And I'll talk about some of the things that you need to look at. Certainly, you need to have a team. You can't, just relying on the accountant, or it may not be sufficient. Typically, I like to assemble a team of lawyer, accountant, financial advisors, so that we can put a good team together to review what we need to do. But without guidance, some of the issues that you have, for example, I'd like to point out is if you're a LLC or S Corp or partnership, and you want to take advantage of the 20% deduction, it's available to individuals and entities. And the intent, of course, as I mentioned earlier, is to reduce the overall tax burden, as it does on flow-through entities, in a manner similar to C corporations, although C corporations, of course, seem to, at least at the beginning, have a better leg up on it. And the way it's done is definition of qualified business income. So if you have a widget business where you're selling product, and you have a sales force, and you have an inside staff, and you're the CEO of the company, and you have income. The question is, can you get a deduction of 20% against the business income? And so, qualified business income is net amount of all your items of income gain and losses from a so-called qualified trade or business, and it also excludes things, investment income like capital gains. So the first trick is making sure your accountant has a handle on, do you know what your QBI or qualified business income is? Whether you're passive or active is not relevant for the 20% deduction. And then computing the 20% gets to be somewhat really where it gets to be problematic. Qualified business income is 50% of the owner's share of W-2 wages paid by the business, excluding the owner's compensation, or 25% of the W-2 wages plus 2.5% of the original cost basis of so-called qualified property. So the Act is designed to deal with service businesses who pay wages, like I just described, a sales business, or if it was, for example, a business that was manufacturing, which had equipment costs and had less wages, you can qualify in that way as well. So, again, depending on the nature of the business, would determine how to calculate your so-called QBI. And the trick that everyone's talking about, and which you probably read, and there was also a Wall Street article last week, I think it was January 19th, on this issue is, what businesses are qualified and what businesses are disqualified. The statute says that qualified business income does not include income from disqualified service businesses. What are they? Health, law, accounting, actuarial sciences, performing arts, consulting, athletics, financial services, or any trade or business where the principal asset is the reputation or skill of one or more of its employee owners. Interesting. That one's going to be one that we're going to be batting around for quite a bit, because Ivana Trump, who has a clothing line, maybe her business doesn't qualify because of her reputation, or maybe some celebrity chef who has a business cannot take advantage of it because people come to the restaurant for the reputation. Of course, my argument is, what if you're a local plumber and you have a plumbing business? People hire plumbers, electricians, and other tradesmen based on, frankly, their reputation. So we need guidance on this. This is going to be a sticking point. And also, they threw in a limitation, so that if you have a small business where if you were single and you didn't have taxable income greater than $157,500, or you filed a joint return, it was $315,000, you actually don't have to worry about these limitations that I just spoke about. So if you have a local accounting practice and you file a joint return and you have QBI and you're under $315,000, you get your 20% deduction calculated as I described above. So we have to look at the different. We have to look at not only the entity, as I mentioned earlier, C Corp, S Corp, LLC, partnership, but also what is the business doing? Does it have wages? Does it have property? Because the property rules are basically you count the cost basis of the qualified property. So it has to be, under the new law, already still being used and still being depreciated. So having a sharp pencil, your accountant having a sharp pencil on all of these items is going to be critical. So my advice is to certainly meet with your tax advisors, your accountant, your lawyer, tax lawyer, whoever you should meet with, and start working on these categories, and also think about possibly rearranging. Many of our clients have businesses where, for example, wages, they have a company which provides all the services and all the wages. They have another company that provides the equipment and owns the tangible assets. And then they have another company that actually does the work, and then they have leasing agreements between the different parties. And that may be a problem because one business, because you have to take each under the Act, you must determine your QBI business by business. So another wrinkle is that if your assets are in the wrong place, or if your employees are in the wrong place, meaning you have multiple entities and they're not in the right place, you may end up severely limiting your 20% deduction. So you have to look at entity selection, what are you doing, and where the people are and where the assets are. So it's as I said earlier, 3D chess. We need to get the accountant on board, financial advisors to some extent, and the attorney to perhaps rearrange things to try to take advantage of this 20% deduction. Because if you cannot, maybe you should be a C Corp. I'm not saying I'm not a fan of C corporations because of double taxation, but maybe you should.
Yes, let me ask you a question about all that, what you just said real quick, and that is when you talk about your income based on reputation, would that affect your law firm?
It could. Well, it could. Well, first of all, as I said earlier, law is one of the excluded areas unless you have a very small amount of income. So, health law, accounting, actuarial sciences. If you had a major law firm, you could not take it, and it was an LLC or LLP, you could not take advantage of the 20% deduction. So it's going to hurt. So, for example, as I told some law firms, maybe you ought to take your equipment and get them out of and have the equipment and outside the law firm, and maybe you can take advantage through a different entity potentially. Because what has to happen is that you must determine your deduction on a business by business basis, and then net them all. So you might be able to rearrange and get some benefits. Go ahead.
I just wanted to bring up an issue that we've heard about several times on the show since the passage of the tax bill, and you somewhat alluded to it twice. One, you referred to exit strategy, and two, you were talking about perhaps some certain advantages of C corporations over LLCs. We understand that there's a provision based on the new tax rates that if your exit strategy is 5 years out, that you might be better off forming a new C corporation in 2018, because if you do exit 5 years out, there's elimination of capital gains tax at the corporate and individual level.
Well, what happens is that's a good question. Generally speaking, if you plan to sell in the near future, you're about ready to turn it in, it favors flow through entities. If, on the other hand, you have a longer term, C corporations, what happens is that if you sell your C corporation, you still have to, I'm not sure if anyone pointed out that there still is the net investment income tax on the sale of C corporation stock. So that's the 3.8% that section, I believe it's 1114, still exists. So, which you don't have on your S corp. But in terms of planning, if you have a C corp, maybe you keep your C corp until at least say 5 years, and then you convert to an S corp. Now, if you do convert to an S corp, there's a built-in gain rule under S corporations that says that if you do convert from C to S to avoid the double taxation, you have 5 years after that to purge the built-in gain. The built-in gain is the appreciation of the business from the time you were either you started a business or at the time that you became a C corp. So that can be a problem very often. And moreover, people who, when corporations are purchased, typically the assets are purchased. The reason why the double tax regime hurts is because the assets are bought, you'll have a corporate level tax, and then when you make a distribution, you'll have a liquidating dividend. So it depends on your horizon. As I said, potential double taxation but if your horizon is very long, you can plan better. If you're C and then you revert back to flow through, if the law changes, and then you give it time, you can take advantage of the low tax rates while it's a C corporation.
I'm sorry.
We don't know how long it's going to last. This tax act.
Right. We are getting close to the end, and I wanted to ask you one more question. Mm-hmm. The latest number I saw was 2,200 corporations have either paid bonuses, increased the compensation to their employees. In case of Apple, gave them $2,500 worth of stock. Now, are these less than altruistic and socially responsible decisions? Are they being driven by taxes more than anything else?
Well, probably both. Certainly these companies have substantial, because you saw Apple's going to repatriate $354 billion. So it's not
Right.
like they don't have money. And so they, there's probably a bit of both. There's a lot of PR going on here. One of my students last night mentioned, and this is a very good point. She said, when I brought this point up that these bonuses are being paid, she says, so why doesn't, and I won't mention the company, doesn't the cable company reduce the cost of the cable bill and give the customers a break? And why doesn't?
I bet that person was a millennial too.
She was, she's certainly younger than me, but she was she was mature. But that's the point. Why doesn't Apple reduce the cost of their products? Because they want to make money, they want to pay low taxes, and then they want to have the ability to do what they want with the money, whether it's giving their employees bonuses or starting new businesses or whatever it might be.
I want to just follow up on that point. Do you think that they're also paying the taxes on the money they give, or are they just giving $2,000 and then taking out the appropriate taxes for it?
Well, that's a good question. In fact, there's case law on that. If you, it's an algorithmic problem where if you pay the tax on someone's wages or compensation, that is also compensation. So now you have to compute the tax on that, which also becomes compensation. Which can compute the tax on that. So no company is going to go through that mess because it ends up being almost twice as much as what you originally paid. So they're probably just paying them straight, comp and treating it as it always does.
Given all the discussions about LLCs versus pass-throughs versus C corporations, there has been a wave over the last 10 or 15 years where many public companies have moved from C corporations to LLCs. Would you expect them to move back to C corporations?
That's another good question. Right now, almost 41% of income, business income, is from pass-through entities, which is up dramatically from when I first started a long time ago. And when this law came out, I mentioned to my colleagues, I said, it feels like I'm going back to the 50s because, C corporations may become more useful than for many years they were not very useful, but with the extraordinarily low C corporation rate versus the still very high individual rate and the problematic getting of the 20% deduction, as I've touched on, it may make sense to be a C corp, especially if you have a long horizon. And if you have a capital intensive business, you probably should be a C corporation.
This has been an extremely illuminating time with Frank Brunetti. Frank, you don't have a personal website, do you? Or how do people reach you if they want to talk to you directly?
I'm at a law firm called Scarinci Hollenbeck in Lyndhurst. And I'm also at Fairleigh Dickinson. You can go on the Fairleigh Dickinson webpage and you Google me there, and you'll see my numerous stuff. And my email, by the way, is Brunetti. It's easy, Brunetti @fdu.edu, and I'd be glad to answer questions and help people out.
Will you repeat that and spell it out for people?
Brunetti, Brunetti at F as in Frank, FDU, F Donald Edward, FDU.edu.
Frank, thank you so much for a really interesting time with us. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome, Don. I appreciate it. Anytime.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Thank you. You too now. Bye-bye.
Dan Perkins here from Recalculating.biz with your featured book. I want to tell you about a recent interview I had with Bob Bethel, a turnaround specialist with lots of success in small business. Bob's new book is Strengthen Your Business, Fail-Proof Strategies for Small Business. He tells us of his life successes and failures that have made him and his clients so successful. Over the years, Bob has brought 77 companies back from the brink and changed them into thriving, profitable businesses. His energy is amazing, and at 74, he proves that you can still have a great deal to give others if you just try. His suggestions are easy to understand and very helpful. One insight struck me was that most companies do not have a plan. The old Chinese proverb says, if you don't know where you're going, then any road will take you there, is true today. Bob Bethel's book, Strengthen Your Business, can be found at Amazon.com or can be ordered at your local bookstore. This has been Dan Perkins with your Recalculating.biz featured book.
You know, Dan, before we go any further, I want our audience to know about your new runaway hit book on Alzheimer's disease and how it affects teenagers. Please tell us about it.
Yeah, Don, thank you. The book is called Why Can't Grammy Remember Me? It's a book written primarily for children ages 9 to 12, but really needs to be read by the entire family. And what I try to do is I try to take the subject matter of dementia and the challenges to a different level in the form of a mystery story with my two little detectives, two little girls, Hudson and Charlotte. And it really creates a breakthrough opportunity for small children and parents and families to begin to understand the problem with dementia. See, Don, the real challenge is that the children are the forgotten people. Mom and Dad spend so much time working to try and take care of Mom and Dad, they don't take the time to explain to the children what's going on in Grandma or Grandpa's brain. So you can buy it at Amazon.com, or you can order it through your local bookstore or any online bookstore besides Amazon has it available. Why Can't Grammy Remember Me? Illustrations are spectacular. A story by Dan Perkins.
Your runaway bestseller, new book.
Why Can't Grammy Remember Me by Dan Perkins.
Dan, bank lending to small businesses, a major contributor to local economies and job creation around the country, is still depressed several years after the end of the U.S. financial crisis. You and I have been talking about this, Dan, for a while, and we have with us Dr. Rebel Cole from Florida Atlantic University, who's going to tell us a lot more about it. Dr. Cole, welcome to the program. Tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about your study, and go from there.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me on to talk about my study. I am a PhD in finance. So I got my degree from the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. I then went and worked at the Federal Reserve Board in Washington for about 10 years under Alan Greenspan as a financial economist. And one of my duties there was to head up the 1993 National Survey of Small Business Finances, which is a nationally representative sample of all small business in the United States. I started my research on small business around that time, and 25 years later, I'm still doing it. Currently, I'm a professor at Florida Atlantic University. The study which we're referring to is a study that was commissioned and just released by the U.S. Small Business Administration. It looks at small business lending after the financial crisis. It's a follow-up paper that I wrote for them back in 2012 that looked at bank lending to small businesses before and during the crisis up through 2010. And what that paper showed is that there was a dramatic decline in small business lending during the crisis years of 2009 and 2010, especially by the big banks. So what this study was designed to do was to extend that forward through 2015 to see if there had been a recovery in small business lending. And what we found is quite surprising. Through the crisis, big business lending, is loans more than $1 million, fell by about 8% from 2008 to 2010, as did small business lending. From 2010 to 2015, or should I say from 2008 to 2015, back through the recovery, loans to big businesses have recovered and are now up by almost 50%, almost $1 trillion more going to big businesses. On the other hand, loans to small businesses, which peaked at $700 billion in 2008, continued to decline through 2013, falling to under $600, and they've recovered just marginally to about $650 billion. So we're still 10% below the pre-crisis levels of small business lending today, whereas big business lending is up 50%.
Well, that's a start. But I'm going to ask one question and turn it over to Dan. But if I heard you correct, you're saying that the bigger banks, they've kind of recovered their willingness to lend to big corporations, but they haven't done it for smaller companies. Is that the main thrust of what you're saying?
That is exactly correct. And my earlier paper, the 2012 paper, we actually looked specifically at the banks that were bailed out by the government and found that those banks, remember the Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP, that those banks actually declined their small business lending by even more than other banks. In other words, we gave them money so they'd lend to small businesses, and instead they cut back even further. And that trend has continued. The big banks paid back the TARP money that they borrowed, but then they continued to cut the lending to small businesses.
Well, I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to let Dan start here.
Doctor, thank you for joining us today. I wanted to follow what you're saying there because I think a lot of people in this country don't realize that it's been almost a decade since the crash. It's been 9 years. And you're saying that big banks are loaning money to big corporations and big business, but in essence, in almost 10 years since the crash, the amount of financing that the major banks are providing to small business has continually declined. And I'm curious, is that a function of an economy that under the Obama administration struggled to get above 2% and averaged less than 2% for his entire 8 years, that the demand for money from small businesses was diminishing because of a lack of economic opportunity. So the banks made the decision that it wasn't going to go anywhere, and that the big corporations, especially the multinationals, presented a better business opportunity to the big banks.
I think there's a lot to that. The big business loans, they're cheaper to underwrite. Underwriting costs are the same for a $10 million loan or a $100,000 loan. So they'd much rather make a $10 million loan. And so what they've consciously decided to do is to pursue that segment of the market. And regarding the performance of the economy, it's important for us to note that small businesses are responsible for half of all employment in the United States and for 2/3 of net new job growth. So if small businesses are not getting credit, they're not investing and they're not hiring, and that means that the economy is going to grow more slowly. And that's why we didn't see growth exceed 3% under Obama, first president in history. Now we're starting to see things pick up. We still have a long way to go. As I said, there's still about $60 billion or 10% below the $700 billion peak from 2008. And here we are, like you say, it's 10 years later. My undergraduate students don't remember the financial crisis, and here we are.
Right. No, I think it's a great point. It gets lost in the translation. That's just how long ago it was. I wonder, Doctor, is given the ability of the American economy to turn on a single person, meaning it turned from Jimmy Carter to Ronald Reagan, it turns from George W. Bush to Barack Obama, which didn't really happen, and then it turned when Obama handed over the reins to Trump. He has clearly come full circle in that the business of America is business. It's not government. And so if the big banks are still not lending to the small business, then where are the small business people getting their money?
Well, that's been a problem is they have been credit constrained, and so they haven't been growing. But they have been turning to alternative lenders. You've heard of fintech. Online lenders are growing in aggregate at triple-digit rates. So, 5 years ago it was like $1 billion, then it was $3 billion, then $5 billion, $10 billion. I think they're up to 15 or 20 billion now. So they're growing in leaps and bounds, these online lenders. But 20 billion is still a drop in the bucket compared to the 700 billion that the banks used to do. So there's a lot to fill in this decline from the big banks. Another place that has another industry that has sort of stepped in, or sub-industry, is the credit unions of all places. Credit union lending has doubled from 2008, about 30 billion to 60 billion today. So they're stepping in and filling in some of the credit to the smallest of the businesses, which has been really good for those firms that were able to get money from a credit union.
So I want to add a couple more questions I want to ask you. Let's talk about the credit union situation for a moment. I guess this is the best way for me to think of it, Doctor. The credit union of today is not your father's credit union. The credit union today is a totally different kind of institution. And the idea that they're going out and buying loans or making loans outside their membership is a whole different model than what the credit unions were before. You had to belong to a company in order to be able to join the credit union. And now you've got credit unions that are open to the public just to come and join. So the whole credit union model, hasn't it changed?
Well, they still require a common bond, but that common bond keeps getting more pronounced. So I joke the largest credit union in the country is the Navy Credit Union, $80 billion. It would be a large bank if it were a bank, and it's sort of like as long as a military plane flew over your house, you're eligible to join. That's a bit of a stretch, but anybody who has any relation to the military.
Okay, so me as a veteran, I could join the Navy Credit Union. Okay, so I want to go back in time. I want to go back in time. I want you to. I don't know whether you have any research or anecdotal information or just pure gut instinct. But what I want to do is go back to prior to 2008, when we were having a pretty good recovery and a pretty good economy. Were the big banks still not lending prior to the collapse to small business? And has it been a downward spiral for a longer period of time than just 2008?
Well, bank regulators first started collecting data on small business lending after the early 1990s, the credit crunch, as they called it back then, 90 to 93. And from first starting to collect in 94 through 2008, small business lending grew steadily every year, including during the recession years, 2001, 2002, 2003, when big business lending dropped somewhat. So there was this sort of very strong trend, positive trend in small business lending right up until the crisis. And something very dramatic happened in the crisis. And one of those things is the sort of the rise of what I call the mega banks. There are now 4 banks that have over $1 trillion in assets. I think it's Wells Fargo, Bank of America, J.P. Morgan, Chase, and let's say Bank of America. So these banks, they dwarf all the other banks. They're about 40% of industry assets and loans, and they don't make small business loans. That's not their business model. And what's happened is they have gotten bigger and bigger after the financial crisis. So J.P. Morgan acquired Washington Mutual, Bank of America acquired Countrywide, Wells Fargo acquired Wachovia. So all these big banks got bigger. And if you look at the portion of loans that big banks allocate to small business, it's less than 10%. Whereas small community banks, they allocate about 90% of their business lending to small business loans. So as you'd have this industry consolidation, at the same time, community banks, 500 or so of those failed, another 1,000 disappeared through mergers. So you see the disappearance of small community banks that make their money lending to small businesses, and all those funds, the deposits that support those loans have gone to these mega banks who don't lend to small businesses. And that, I think, is one of the fundamental problems that we need to deal with is we've got to make these big banks smaller and incentivize them to lend to small businesses.
Before we go much further, Doctor, is your report available to be viewed online?
It is. It's available from the Small Business Administration website. If you go to www.sba.org/advocacy, there should be a link on the right-hand side of the page. Or if you Google my name and small business lending crisis, you'll probably find it there as well.
So moving back to the since you used the word crisis, the decline in large bank lending, was it done based on default rates or a philosophical change?
I'm sure they'd like to claim it is, but the default rates on business loans were nothing like they were on some of the commercial real estate loans and on home mortgages, which the banks have not so much abandoned. I mean, well, to some extent they have kind of abandoned residential loans. But next word goes to another issue you raised here, which is what else happened in 2008 that would explain how you had this decline in small business lending? Well, there was a change in the regulatory regime. We had a new president come in, and for 8 years they rained down oppressive regulations on the banking industry. The banking industry got blamed for the financial crisis. The large banks were largely responsible, but the small banks paid the price. And with all this regulation and regulatory burden, the small banks have not been able to lend as much, and they're going out of business. So that also is playing into the picture.
Do you think, Doctor, that in addition to rain down all this regulation on the banks, the Obama government put a lot of regulations on small business and business in general that were retardants to trying to grow and build businesses?
Certainly there was regulatory burden on small businesses, but on financial insured depositories, it was much, much worse. So to the extent that they put regulations on small businesses, that would depress demand for credit, and to the extent they did this on the banks, that reduced the supply of credit. And the net is that small businesses have grown more slowly and hired fewer people, and that's why we have this anemic 1% to 2% growth in GDP year after year after year, which the Obama administration said is the new norm. We can never grow at 3%, but now, less than a year after Trump took over as president, we're growing at 3%.
And we could possibly see 4 or higher by the end of 2018. Doctor,
the tax reform bill just passed, so absolutely.
Yes.
When cutting the corporate tax from the highest in the world at 35% to 21% is a huge thing. Most of banks are C corporations, so they're going to see their earnings go. They're going to make more loans. Businesses are going to bring money back from overseas. Everybody's going to be hiring. They're going to be paying bonuses. It's going to be something to see.
And the Democrats, not a single Democrat voted for the tax legislation. So they're going to have a hard woe I think in November of convincing people that they really have their back. Let's go to alternative financing for a second. You briefly mentioned alternative financing, and you talked about the credit unions. But let's talk about fintech. You say that they're not really banks, but yet they're making loans. What are they?
They're almost like hedge funds, really. I've been working a little bit with one on helping with the marketing message based on some of my research. And what they do is they make small loans, not really small loans, but loans of $100,000 or so for mid-sized small businesses. And they're not banks. They don't take deposits. These funds come from investors, and banks have to hold capital against their loans as a cushion because they are insured depositories. These fintech lenders do not, so they have a huge funding advantage over banks, and that's why they're growing it. Like I say, triple-digit in aggregate every year for the last 5 years or so. So this does represent a real threat to bank lending to small businesses going forward, and perhaps it's a better lending model.
But if the big banks are no longer haven't been interested in 10 years in making business loans to small business, then the fintech lenders come in and take over the market. It would seem to me the only way that the banks, if they want to get back into the business, are going to have to start buying the fintech lenders, and that puts them right back into the regulatory environment. So the business model doesn't make sense. Do you think that the fintech lender, now we've been told in some of the interviews that we've had with people who are in the fintech lending business that rates can be higher for a fintech lender, but the process is much quicker and businesses can get their money much quicker, and they'll take a little more credit risk than what the banks used to.
Is that true?
Oh yes, I've talked to several small business owners who, to get a loan from a bank, they have to spend a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks of their time when they're trying to run their businesses with the loan officer, explaining their business model, explaining why they need the loan, documenting their loan request with financial record after financial record, and then after all that, they don't even know if they're going to get the credit. So I've heard them say, I'd rather pay an extra 200, 300, 400, 500 basis points and get the credit, and rather than have to deal with this onerous lending procedure from the banks. Again, a lot of those onerous lending procedures are because of regulatory burden. The banks having to document everything they do so that when the examiners come in, they can defend their lending decisions. FinTech doesn't have that issue.
Oh, I have to tell you, I've been listening to this with bated breath. I've had, like Dan, I've had my own business for 20, 25 years. And dealing with banks as a small business has always been like pulling teeth. And at the end of it, there's nothing. A big bank, at the end, they're saying, well, this or that or the other thing. Or the worst one I hear is, well, someone up the line decided not to do the loan. Well, let me talk to that person. You can't. He is not available. But let me ask. I think your study, but Dr. Cole, have you looked into the various SBA programs, and how have they affected the lending statistics? Have they been as effective as they could be, or have you done any work in this area?
I've worked with the SBA long. I haven't worked too much directly with the SBA programs, but we got to remember the SBA programs they're really small. Like I think 40 billion total compared with the $700 billion that the banks were lending to small businesses. So they're kind of on. They're put it this way: they're like smaller than the credit unions in the total picture. Now, they do fulfill a good function, the guaranteed loans, and it's been very helpful for a lot of companies, but it's a small part of the small business lending market.
And Doctor, wouldn't you say that the SBA loans are almost as complicated as trying to get a loan from a money center bank?
I've heard that they're more complicated because the SBA is basically the banks are lending the money, but the SBA is guaranteeing the loan. So again, the SBA has to put into place practices to try and limit their downside risk because they don't want to lose that money.
I've always found that many small companies depend on friends and family to start with, then the credit cards, then they go to some lending organization. Then finally, many companies become, they generate cash enough to be self-funding. Is that what you find, or is that a model I'm not seeing?
It's interesting you asked that. I'm working on a couple of new studies using data from the Kaufman Firm Surveys, which is a survey funded by the Kaufman Institute that looks at firms that were startups in 2004 and follows them through their first 8 years of life and looking at how they fund themselves at startup. And it turns out that family and friends are really not that big of a source of credit. Where they really get their money from is, not surprisingly, from banks. They get money from banks not only borrowing as the firm, but borrowing in the name of the owner. So you probably know lots of people who took out a home equity line on their house or charged up their credit cards, some personal credit cards, and use that. And then, a lot of times family will do the same thing. But the real source of those funds, again, goes back to the banks. And so if the banks aren't lending, those funds aren't available for the startups. So that's another reason why we've seen this anemic growth, because startup activity has been squelched by the lack of credit.
Dr. Cole, again, it may sound like a broken record, but I just want to make sure I'm hearing this correctly, because I think your work is very groundbreaking. In effect, you're saying that the big banks in particular are really not serving the small business sector as well as they could, nor as well as they did. Is that would that be a correct statement?
I would wholeheartedly endorse that. And moreover, my study makes some recommendations about how to deal with that. And much to my pleasure, I saw that the one of the new Trump regulatory appointees, I think it's the new control of the currency, sort of came out on the same side. And that has to do with Community Reinvestment Act regulations. So the Community Reinvestment Act was passed back in 1974 to outlaw sort of redlining by banks. And it's been used as a way to beat the banks into doing good in their communities through what they call community developed lending. Community developed lending is a very narrowly defined, for it's like mortgages for affordable housing and grants to community organizations and so on and so forth. One way to incentivize the big banks to lend to small businesses is to allow them to count small business loans in minority and underdeveloped communities as these community development loans. And so that's an easy policy to put into place to let the banks get credit for their community reinvestment examinations by making small business loans instead of just making housing loans. And that allows the banks to diversify their risk in these communities and allows the business owners in these communities to get badly needed credit. So that's a very positive step that I see going forward.
Well, Doctor, I'm going to name names, but I've been a Bank of America depositor for over 20 years in various iterations, and they always send me stuff about being the bank for small business. Yet everybody I've sent to the bank has been rejected. Maybe a quality of the people I know, but have been rejected for loans. And some of them have been in minority areas. One of my past time, I worked for Essence magazine, the magazine for black women, and as a result, I was heavily involved with helping. And it seems to me these banks advertise their small business, but are hypocritical about it. That's my opinion. Perhaps I know you don't want to say it directly, but have you also seen any data to support that?
Absolutely. Your segue means my next topic I really wanted to mention was how do big banks make small business loans these days? They don't make lines of credits anymore. What they do is they steer their small business customers to the consumer side of the bank to get a credit card, or in some cases, like Capital One, they have small business credit cards. But essentially, they're making credit card loans, and that's important because they can credit score those loans. In the underwriting process, they can use the owner's personal credit score as a way to underwrite those loans. And then when the credit card loans are made, they can securitize those and sell them off of their balance sheet if they so desire. So that's been a big switch in the way that small businesses get credit for small loans. But those are typically loans only up to about $30,000 or $40,000. And if you talk to these bankers, as I have, they'll tell you that once you get up to about $50,000, they have to go back to the traditional underwriting model, which is very time intensive and document intensive. And as you say, a lot of firms don't pass the test for getting those larger loans.
Dan, back to you. I could go on for I'm sorry I'm so enthusiastic. Well, I'm not sorry I'm enthusiastic, but I just feel, Dr. Cole, that you have the data for what Dan and I have been talking about for a couple of years. Do you agree, Dan?
Yeah, I do, and it's already way past the amount of time that we've allocated for the doctor. I would just like to say again, Doctor, please give them the web address to where they can get your report from the government and from you.
Well, the web address would be www.sba.org/advocacy, and you can get all of my research going back into the early 1990s at my website, and it's just www.rebelcole.com, just my first name and last name, rebelcole.com. And I've been writing on this, let's say, since the early 90s. The new study is not up on there yet, but I'll make sure it gets up there later today.
Well, we'll have you on a link to your website on our website tonight, thank you so much for being with us today.
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Dan, we only have time to say goodbye for today.
Well, it was a great show, and we had some terrific guests, and hopefully our listeners enjoyed it and also got some good ideas of some of the challenges of starting your own small business. So this is Dan Perkins.
And Don Mazzella.
Thanks for listening.
Thank you for joining us on Recalculating. We hope the information you received on today's episode was helpful to you in starting and growing your business. Please go to our website, recalculating.biz, to contact us, to listen to past shows, and see special offers. Until next time, remember, if you grow, we grow. Join us next week for more helpful ideas to make your business a great success. Recalculating, a program designed to help you be successful.